Welcome to Week 8, the new advertising, the creative revolution in global ads. During the 1950s and 60s, we have a new breed, a new generation of consumers. After World War II, the post-war boom in the economy and the baby boom resulted in a generation of children that were raised with more money, more food, better clothes, more opportunities, more physical objects than ever before. And that generation of affluent baby boomers really kicked the consumer society into full gear. For the first time in the United States, there were more young people than old. And so there was a shift to youth culture overall. This included a sense of pleasure seeking versus the previous generation's make and mend mentality that was forged during the Depression and during the wars. This new consumerism represented a powerful economic and cultural force. Young people, they appreciated humor, wit, and satire. And on the part of ad agencies, there was an expansion of consumer and market research from global corporations and products. The baby boom generation was more aware of the manipulation of advertising and skeptical of the 1950s advertising's subconscious manipulations and subliminal attempts at brainwashing. So they saw themselves as more sophisticated and more discerning, and also as rejecting a lot of the values of the previous generation. And yes, it was like this. If you've seen the show Mad Men, the series, was based on the real agencies of the 50s and 60s. The particular agency in the show was a more conservative agency from the 50s, and then sort of showing how this new age of the 60s affected the business as it went along. And the actual upstart, hip, slick, and cool new agency was started by these guys. Of course, they were much younger when they started the agency. It was called Doyle Dane Bernbach. I'm sure you'll have heard all about it in the Art and Copy movie, but this is Ned Doyle, Maxwell Dane, and Bill Bernbach on the right with the bald domed head and the intense look. These were the real Mad Men. Bernbach was a creative leader who revolutionized the way that advertising was approached. This became their corporate headquarters on Madison Avenue. Again, kind of a symbol of all of advertising. It's the shape that was used on the opening for Mad Men. And at DDB, they ushered in a new era of advertising by developing a unique strategy for each campaign and looking for meaningful differences between products, and then communicating those differences in creative, intelligent ways. This is a scene of the creative team from DDB working on the Daisy commercial, which was done for the election of John F. Kennedy when he was running against Richard Nixon. Bernbach established the idea of creative teams that copywriters and art directors would work together to create concepts. At the time, there were new glossy magazines in the Sunday supplements and newspapers with large audiences, and other burgeoning color magazines that were ideal formats for thought-provoking ads. And with the arrival of color TV in 1969, there was a new emphasis on attention-getting visuals in moving pictures. This is a classic DDB-styled ad. This campaign for Chivas Regal emphasized the expensive quality of the scotch, how rare and special it was. The visuals were simple and powerful, with a large image often and a concise headline. And there was a new wit, humor, and cleverness that somehow rang true, based around an essential truth about the product. The Chivas Regal campaign, like many from DDB, ran for a long time with different iterations, but all hanging together with the same concept. By incorporating creativity, simplicity, and humor into the ads, Bernbach was able to create some of the most successful campaigns in the history of advertising. Success marked by sales as well as awards, and also the longevity of the campaigns. He strongly believed that advertising success hinged on the quality of the product. One of his most quoted lines was, "Nothing makes a bad product fail faster than a great advertising campaign." This guiding principle led DDB to select only products that could live up to their advertising. Of course, the most famous campaign from DDB is the Volkswagen campaign. This was an early ad in the series, arguably the most famous one ever. The stark black and white simple ads with sans serif type were the opposite of previous car advertising that had been for large American cars with a lot of elaborate fins and sort of lots of hyperbole in the copy-driven long copy ads. Helmut Krohn was the art director. He was another European emigre who brought a modernist aesthetic of simplicity and use of white space and sans serif type to advertising. Consistency and repetition helped to create a distinct brand identity for Volkswagen and reinforced a product's position in the market over many years and in many different countries. And this formula for success was eventually exported to other agencies around the world. Formula that wasn't a formula. Client of DDB was Orbox, which was a New York City department store. It's hard to overstate the attention that these new ads got and what the talk value was of this fresh approach. The first great modern advertising writer, Phyllis Robinson, called A Genius by Bill Bernbach. He made her a copy chief when he opened DDB. Before her, female writers tended to only work on women's accounts, such as beauty products, and she actually asked to get off of Orbox and work on some other stuff. She famously did campaigns for Levy's Bread and Polaroid, as well as Orbox. Here's another one of the clever ads for Orbox, a little bit risque. One of my favorites, we regret to inform you your school stuff is ready at Orbox. Beautiful use of white space and composition, focusing the reader's attention on the image and the headline. Not all of the ads by DDB were funny. Sometimes shock value worked also. This striking newspaper ad was a political action effort in 1967 to get people to write Congress about a rat extermination bill. This heartwarming campaign from Phyllis Robinson and the art director Bill Taupin emphasized that you don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's. One of the brash young upstarts at DDB was the art director George Lois. This also obviously is him recently. He's still alive, still kicking. He wrote that an art director must treat words with the same reverence that he accords graphics because the verbal and visual elements of modern communication are as indivisible as words and music in song. He was known for his outspoken ideas and beliefs as well as his talent in advertising. Went on to found several different agencies with his name on them. This was an early ad that he did, a newspaper ad for Coldine cough syrup, where most medication ads used hard sell and long copy. This showed a simple background with 12 words that suggested a midnight talk between concerned parents. And this famous campaign he did for Wolfschmidt's vodka had the vodka and an orange anthropomorphized having a little conversation. The vodka says, "You sweet doll, I appreciate you. I've got taste. I'll bring out the real orange in you. I'll make you famous. Kiss me." And the orange says, "Who was that tomato I saw you with last week?" And in fact, there had been a previous ad with a tomato. In 1962, Esquire magazine was in some financial trouble, and they asked George Lois to help sell more copies of the magazine. He thought that design had no place on the cover of a magazine, but they should be statements capable of capturing the reader with a spirited comment or even a provocative image. This is one of the most famous ones, featuring the boxer Muhammad Ali. He had been stripped of his world heavyweight championship because he refused military service. He became a conscientious objector and would not go to Vietnam. This is him posing as Saint Sebastian, who was a famous religious martyr condemned by the Roman emperor and shot by arrows. And the idea has had such sticking power that it's been repeated a number of times on Esquire covers and other magazines for various different people. George Lois did a long series of these, and even though this is an advertising talk, I think that they function as ads for the magazine as well as covers. On the other hand, we have some remarkable women entering the workforce in this generation, including Shirley Polikoff, who was an iconic copywriter and revolutionized the perception of hair coloring. May not seem that important now, but It was a dramatic reinvention for a product. Before her campaigns, hair dye was seen to be the provenance of actresses, models, and sex workers. It was not something that so-called nice women admitted to using. So she came up with the iconic headline, "Does she or doesn't she?" for Clairol. Her male bosses thought that the campaign was too provocative and sexually suggestive, but she conducted her own focus groups with women who loved the idea and was able to sell it through. She worked for many different brands of Clairol, including Lady Clairol and Miss Clairol. This one is another famous headline, "Is it true that blondes have more fun?" And then for Nice and Easy, she wrote the line, "The closer he gets, the better you look." The photographer Henry Wolff was an influential visual communicator in this period also. He had studied under Alexei Brodovich. Wolff became the art director of Esquire magazine in 1953 and then replaced Brodovich as the art director of Harper's Bazaar. He was both a photographer and a designer. So here we have a shot of the cover is the Americanization of Paris, showing an instant red wine packet. The cover inspired letters asking where instant wine could be purchased. He tried to use sophistication and inventiveness in his work, an imaginative visual solution for an ordinary design problem, the wonders of water. The logo is also refracted, which is a nice detail. Another cover for Harper's Bazaar. The colors in the peacock echoed in the eye makeup on the opposite eye. Some typographic trends that crossed into advertising that you might recognize from the editorial work we looked at last week. This is by the art director Jean Federico, an ad in 1953. This is an ad for Women's Day. It's a typical media ad talking about how likely the reader of Women's Day is to spend. So it's a good place to run an ad because she's going to go out and go shopping. This is another example of that kind of interactive type by the ad agency Young and Rubicam in 1960. Okay, so let's take a look at how the United States of America exported this new culture of creativity in advertising out and around the world. During this period from the 1960s to the 1980s is considered the golden age in the history of advertising because, among other things, advertising transformed into something of a real science with psychologists, focus groups, researchers, and the use of data. Media spending in both print and television increased year over year, every year, sometimes exponentially. Brands, especially American brands, expanded globally in search of new markets and profits. And by the 1990s, global domination of major brands like Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Coke, Pepsi, Ford, Volkswagen, etc. was the norm. The pioneers of the so-called creative revolution in advertising, out of which the big idea emerged, realized that to truly capture an audience's attention and impart lasting messages, they had to continually amuse. So a culture of advertising as entertainment arose. Beyond the 1960s, advertising professionals became aware of their own roles in the development of consumer culture and realized for the first time that advertising had become part of culture. The ad industry also marketed itself as a place where anyone with clever ideas from any kind of background could become rich and mildly famous. The creative revolution helped to shift the industry and keep it in touch with the new culture.
The vitamins that delight me. Oh, no.
However, advertising was also a cultural gatekeeper of the industry. However, the advertising industry was also a cultural gatekeeper. Although the decade of the 1960s experienced significant social upheaval with the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Sexual Revolution, advertising portrayals lagged behind the times and continued to place women and minorities in subservient roles, if they were shown at all. Centralized corporate control and expatriate leadership in agencies maintained and amplified a Eurocentric colonialist culture in emerging economies around the world. creative departments and agencies remained woefully one-dimensional well into the 2000s, overwhelmingly white, male, and English-speaking. And sexist and racist messages and humor predominated in global ads, probably until the current day. So let's look at how the creative revolution took place in Britain. Early on, American agencies opened branches in the United Kingdom. Older agencies like J. Walter Thompson, McCann, and Ogilvy and Mather already had United Kingdom offices, and these creative upstarts like DDB and Papert Koenig Lois, George Lois's agency, opened British offices. The Designer and Art Director competition and Campaign magazine both launched in 1963 to respectively award prizes for creativity in the UK and cover the business side of the industry. These two chaps opened their own shop. It did not take long for small agencies to copy the DDB creative team model with their own particularly British sense of humor and style. As in the United States, the ad industry was a place where working class lads could get rich quick by living off their wits. An example here is the young Maurice and Charles Saatchi, who were founders of the Saatchi & Saatchi global empire. Charles was the creative leader that started an agency, and Maurice was an entrepreneurial businessman who started Campaign magazine, previously mentioned, and then joined his brother to become a hot creative shop in England. One of their first ads was Kramer Saatchi's 1969 Pregnant Man ad for the Family Planning Association. It's a classic example of the more image-led advertising with a new emphasis on attention-grabbing pictures and simple executions based on powerful ideas. British tobacco ads were different because the only copy allowed was a large government warning. Anti-smoking regulations created parameters that inadvertently led to beautiful and subtle image-only ads like this famous campaign for Silk Cut. Each ad is like a visual puzzle that never states the brand name but still implies the smoothness of taste and luxury associated with the Silk Cut purple package. The campaign's been called the most successful cigarette advertising ever. A lot of time has been devoted to decoding and psychoanalyzing the imagery that's sometimes surreal. This one is a symbol inside of a symbol. There's no literal cut shown. It's merely implied. If you were in the know enough to catch the reference to the movie Psycho, where the killer slashes a shower curtain with a knife. Another famous ad by the Saatchis was credited for Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party winning the election over the existing Labour Party. Another group of creative upstarts was Collett Dickinson Pierce, CDP, led by the creative director Colin Millward, who is here in the center with the black. British ad agencies fed off the humor and the quirkiness of British life.
Happiness is a cigar called Hamlet, the mild cigar.
And later they did this famous campaign for Heineken, refreshing the parts other beers cannot reach, a little bit risque and using all kinds of different images from pop culture to more psychedelic looking creatures here. When the creative director, Colin Millward, was asked, why do so many great art directors come from Yorkshire, which is where he grew up? Yorkshire is an industrial town in North England. I guess it would be something like Scranton to us. He famously said, pollution covers every horizontal surface with a film of grime, so you can draw anywhere. So there you go. Art directors come from places where there's a lot of dirt. You can see how this structure is similar to the Doyle Dane Volkswagen ads with white space, a simple targeted message, and well-produced cinematic commercials. Like British society as a whole, British advertising was slower than the US version to adapt to the feminist movement and more modern portrayals of women, and tended to objectify women even in ads directed to female shoppers. This is another iconic cigarette campaign, this one for Benson and Hedges. Similarly, the cigarette pack is tucked in there as an icon with no copy. This man, now Sir John Hegarty, helped to found the agency Bartle Bodle Hegarty. They were probably most famous for this commercial from the 1980s for Levi's. Hegarty's art direction style built off of the tradition of poster design of European posters and made ads more poster-like, including this one for Bodlington's Cream Ale. They created the campaign Keep Walking for Johnny Walker. I believe that's still running. This is another cheeky ad, British ad, that was a self-promotion for yet another newly formed agency in the heyday of the 60s, Abbott, Mead, Davies, and Vickers. The founders are shown here asking for a food account, which they were duly awarded by the Sainsbury's grocery chain. They're also famous for a long-running series for The Economist. They mimicked the magazine's masthead colors and typography, and very clear and witty headlines that imply that only successful people read The Economist, and yet that it's accessible to everyone. This headline, "I never read The Economist," is captioned by management trainee aged 42. British agencies also need to be mentioned as the proving ground for a number of commercial directors that then became film directors, among them Ridley Scott, who formed the production company RSA to work on commercials, and of course directed the iconic movie Blade Runner, as well as Thelma and Louise, Gladiator, The Martian, and tons of other movies. Another director that emerged from the advertising culture of the 1960s in England was Alan Parker. His first movie was Bugsy Malone, a kids' gangster movie with Jodie Foster and Scott Baio. Went on to do Pink Floyd The Wall, a great little flick called The Commitments, and on, Midnight Express, a number of other classic movies, and is still working today. Also moved into directing television series. Meanwhile, across the channel in France, an amazing advertising story. This iconic fellow, Marcel Blaustein, was born to Jewish parents in Paris and grew up working in their furniture store and then making ads for them. He was really interested in technology and the future. He was a pilot and an aficionado of ham radio, and at age 20 decided to create an advertising agency. He called it Publicis, combining the French word for advertising, publicité, and the sound of the number six, which was his lucky number, the year of his birth and the year of the founding of the agency. He was an early adopter of radio and cinema ads, made and sold films for cinema, opened a radio station, and was a millionaire after World War I. Grew the agency by great leaps and bounds, especially with radio advertising, introduced Edith Piaf to the world. And then in World War II, Hitler invaded France, Paris fell, and he fled, being Jewish. He lost everything, his whole business. He had to leave everything behind. Went to England, became a fighter pilot in the French resistance, and dropped bombs on German airplanes and across France, and then returned to Paris after the war, was a hero, rebuilt his business, clients came back. He built a fantastically gigantic agency right on the corner of the roads leading to the Arc de Triomphe in an old hotel. And then, crazily enough, that hotel burnt to the ground, and he had to start all over again. Made his third fortune and is Publicis is a gigantic holding company today, run still by Maurice Levy, who, as a young man, he had just been hired when the fire happened. He was in charge of a fledgling computer department in 1956 is when it burned down, and he ran into the burning building to rescue the computer files that contained all of their client information and their, television commercials and contracts and everything, and sort of saved the business. He was also a visionary like Marcel that foresaw the importance of the digital age and digital media, which helped them to dominate advertising well into the 2000s. One of their first ads for Boursin cheese, also one of their longtime clients, was DIM, a hosiery manufacturer. The first agency that was designed to be a multinational pan-European shop called Tregos Bonage Weisendanger Ajroldi, more commonly known as TBWA. It started in Paris and then opened offices in Milan, Frankfurt, and London. One of their most famous campaigns was for Absolute Vodka, still running today. A very simple campaign. You can see the influence of the DDB idea, strong visual, simple, straightforward caption, and they ran tons and tons and tons of these ads in the series. But after the acquisition by TBWA, produced this wonderful campaign for Chiat/Day's longtime client, Apple. And there was a particular Italian style of the new advertising. Of course, some design masters like Armando Testa were already working in their various countries. Armando Testa in Italy, making wonderful posters like this in the 1940s and 50s. He had a unique voice in both art and commerce, was a fine artist, a photographer, an illustrator, and a designer. And as the advertising industry grew, he added more strategic people and writers, but continued to produce these single-minded, poster-like, very graphic images. His bold style is instantly recognizable. This was an early ad for the Industrial Color, or Exposition, I guess, in Milan. This is an ad for an aperitif before dinner drink. Testa experimented with stop-motion animation in the early days of television, was an innovator in the new use of the medium. And in fact, in Italy, ads were restricted to a 10-minute period every night. In Tesla's hands, this media slice was called carousel, and it became the most watched show on TV. You can see how product sponsorships were interwoven with small pieces of content. It reminds me a little bit of Sesame Street here, where the program was broken up by small messages. Is that of a global agency that retains his sleek, modernist aesthetic and works for a lot of Italian and international brands like Fiat and Lazava coffee. Another unique voice in Italy is that of Olivero Tossi. Began as a photographer, a sought-after fashion photographer in Italy. Of course, Milan is a center of European fashion. And he worked early on with the Italian fashion brand Benetton, who did colorful knitwear and developed that brand into a true global name. Here you can see the genesis of the idea Benetton has all the colors in the world, which became the long-running campaign, The United Colors of Benetton. With a simple tagline, the ads evolved into an increasingly provocative series of comments about race and religious tolerance, AIDS, the international refugee crisis, the death penalty, and other topics in the news. It became kind of a challenge to top themselves year after year, and he coined the phrase shockvertising. This is one of the most controversial ads, picturing a patient dying of AIDS with their family looking on, and of course the visual association is with the Pietà, the suffering Christ, which especially in Italy made it very controversial. And over in Germany, Karl Gerstner was famous already for founding the Swiss typographic style, and he extended his innovative use of type into advertising to form the agency GGK. As in this ad for a measuring equipment, the headline translates to full, 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 empty. Another typographic ad, this one for a camera system, talking about clarity and depth of field. The agency earned a reputation as the most creative agency in the German-speaking markets, working with clients such as Lufthansa and Volkswagen. In 1962, they were offered to be taken over by Doyle Dane, but rejected that offer. When we look at these ads, it makes it clear how much the art directors of the Doyle Dane Bernbach style, like Helmut Krohn, owed to the traditions of Swiss design. The DDB innovation was to marry these kind of clean, modern graphics with white space and sans serif type, but to marry them with witty copy and razor-sharp strategy to come up with campaigns like the Volkswagen campaign. This headline reads, "Waste," and the ad is for IBM. You might as well transpose that with lemon, and it would become the Volkswagen ad, even with the same strategy. Meanwhile, across the wall in Germany, in the Eastern Bloc, over, of course, the communist countries during the Cold War, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Russia, Romania, etc., had no consumer advertising because all industries were state-owned and didn't really require advertising if there was only one brand of perfume and one brand of soap or whatever, falling more into sort of propaganda territory. It was not really easy to introduce advertising in cultures that were still skeptical about this kind of communication and where even owning a TV set was a luxury. A book I was reading pointed out that people were still starving in Moscow in 1991, and probably actually today, too. The economy is not great there. But nevertheless, early in-market products like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Levi's immediately there battling for space. Here's some kind of bizarre television commercials from the 1980s. Cultural humor in the style of the creative ads coming out of New York with simplified visuals didn't really translate. They didn't really have any advertising again until the 1980s when this kind of stuff appeared on TV. Eastern European ad spend is still only a quarter of the West. I think it's interesting that if you know anything about film history, of techniques were pioneered in Russia. All right, and out in the rest of the world, as global economies improved in countries around the world, the proliferation of media channels and big brands soon followed, and together all of those factors helped launch and grow ad agencies in all the corners of the earth. The sophistication of consumers everywhere and the talent of homegrown writers and artists raised the bar for creativity in international competitions like these. There's the Cannes Lion, the D&AD pencil, the Clio statuette, the One Show gold pencil, the Graphice gold G, and the Art Director's gold cube. All very sought-after awards for creativity and advertising. And this kind of international competition started in the early 60s, but really took off in the late 70s and 80s with entries from all around the world. One of the hot areas that started winning lots of awards and getting attention internationally was South America, with a couple of agencies. This pair of gentlemen from Argentina, Agula and Bacchetti, got a lot of attention from high-impact visuals like this one, illustrating the concept of what goes around comes around, don't mistreat your dog. And notice in a lot of these ads from all over the world that English kind of became the default language of advertising, both because of the consumer culture that, emerged out of the United States and through Britain, but also because of the international advertising competition culture, where a lot of the judges were mono-language speakers, either from the United States or from England. So to win in the awards shows, it was easier if you had an English headline, even in countries where English was perhaps not the most widely spoken language. This gentleman is Washington Oliveto. His agency was called W in Brazil. This is one of the agency's award-winning campaigns. The headline's in English, Donate Your Past to Us. The logo is in Portuguese, which is the language spoken in Brazil. Another visually driven ad, Warm Clothing Also Saves Lives. Very famous campaign from the agency Allmap. The creative director's name is Marcelo Serpa, founder of the agency. This compares aspirin versus extra strength aspirin. Headache gets stronger, the medicine gets stronger. Another ad for the same client for a less painful world. Another ad from Allmap, campaign. There's been a number of award-winning campaigns for the flip-flop company Havaianas. They're almost works of art. You can see the emphasis on really captivating and visually driven ads. In Africa, another unique situation, a lot of companies avoided the South African market during apartheid, but then when apartheid ended in the early 90s, business came flooding back. These two started up a small agency then called Hunt Lascaris, and Reg Garis is a writer who did a lot of books and publishing, article writing about why it was a good idea to invest in South Africa. They were tapped to do the first political campaign in 1994 for the African National Congress. Interestingly, of the 23 million people in the country, 18 million had never voted before apartheid ended. After the election, as Hunt says, South Africa went from being the poisonous country to being the prodigal country. The agency was busy with clients as diverse as Seychelles Tourism, that's the island of the Seychelles, I guess is how you pronounce it. This ad is one of the typically visually driven works from Hunt Lascaris. They also did this award-winning campaign for the newspaper The Zimbabwean, which had an anti-Mugabe editorial stance. They began sweeping the international awards competitions with smart and elegant, again, visually driven work. Over in Thailand, another creative hotspot, area where expatriates from English-speaking colonial occupiers hung around, formed some agencies, and then they became more locally owned and operated. This is one of the most famous female creatives in the world. Her name is Juriporn Tidamrong. She started an agency called J United, which was, her nickname is Judy, and it's now affiliated with Gray. She's the chief creative officer, and a quote from her says, "It's not true that women in Asia have a harder time getting to the higher echelons of the ad business. I actually think women here have more opportunities than in North America or Europe. In Thailand, for example, there are many female creative directors, and that's not only true in the creative departments. You see a lot of senior management and CEO positions occupied by women, and it's true all over the country," which is good news. Makes me want to move to Thailand. One of her great campaign is for this Tupperware-like product shown in the lower left. Many Thai ads also, again, are in English, but these bold visuals transcend language barriers. This ad visually promises to lock it in the right place, meaning the smell of shellfish. A couple other executions you should check out. This visual-only ad illustrates the heat of the American hot sauce Tabasco. In India, speaking of hot spots and hot sauce, a number of great agencies. Piyush Pandey is the first Khan Grand Jury chairman from Asia. His agency is in Mumbai, India. They're famous for, among other campaigns, this one for adoption. The headline reads, "You will receive more than you give." Another campaign from the office for Philips flashlights. Totally genius. Of course, the history of mass communication in China goes back as far as early printing in the Tang Dynasty. But in terms of modern communication, we can look at trade posters in Shanghai when it opened trade with the West in the early 1900s. The artist T.K. Zia became known for his Shanghai girls in ads like this for Pond's Vanishing Cream and other products in a style that resembles Art Nouveau. As we look at these ads, you can't help but think about how beauty products around the world have marketed skin lighteners, makeup, and other products that promise to lighten or brighten the skin. Whether you see that as a cause or an effect of a system of privilege and oppression based on skin color, it's definitely a problem that still exists in many markets. Coca-Cola in China, like other places, was almost always first in market when trade was allowed. Tobacco has also been marketed specifically to women with a promise of independence, of freedom, personal expression, or sometimes weight control. Carl Crow was an American from the Midwest who moved to China shortly after World War I to take part in the booming economy. He wrote a number of books, including this one, 400 Million Customers, kind of revealing his greed. He said Europe needed everything China could produce: rubber, coal, soybean oil, cotton, silk, and cigarettes. He started the Carl Crow ad agency and published a number of books encouraging Westerners to invest in China. So during the Cultural Revolution, when industries were nationalized, advertising was limited to government propaganda messages until the Open China policy in 1976. This poster from the 1950s reads, "The American nuclear bomb is nothing but a paper tiger." Cold War message. Coca-Cola re-entered China when the trade rules were relaxed in 1979 and was among the first television advertisers. Guangdong TV launched an advertising business, and then the state television company began to broadcast ads. And around then, the top ad agencies from Japan opened offices in both Beijing and Shanghai. This ad is from a whole campaign that was aimed at American expatriates or business travelers in the 1960s, talking about how Coke is accepted worldwide. By 1994, with ad sales booming, global ad agencies entered the Chinese market, and after that, there was no turning back. This is an anti-smoking poster by the agency Ted Bates 141, done in 1996 with a very retro Russian photo montage look. This little public service announcement about ecological awareness is done by the Japanese agency's Dentsu's Shanghai office. Many exchange programs were established for Chinese ad professionals to learn the newest advertising agency practices, and professionals working at foreign ad agencies were invited to give talks about advertising. Kids left China to study advertising and graphic design all around the world in the 90s. Several schools were formed in China also. This is an ad from the international agency BBDO in Shanghai. During the 1980s, Japanese brands in advertising achieved wide distribution in China. Brands such as National, Panasonic, Sony, Toshiba, and Toyota became household names among urban Chinese. This is an ad for a Braun food processor that recalls the botanical and calligraphic compositions of ancient Chinese scrolls, using ginger and limes to create water lilies. And in Japan, an advertising innovator was Hiroshi Mitsunaga, who opened an agency in 1901. He was a war reporter and made an agreement with the UPI, United Press International, to provide news from Japan when the first underground telegraphic cable was installed. He created the company Nippon Denpo Tsushin Sha, which meant Japan Telegraphic Communication Company. The shortened nickname that it went by was Dentsu, and they were really a monopoly that was created with the formation of the telegraph and newspaper and advertising industries, was nationalized in 1936 and then privatized again. Now over 6,000 people work just in the Tokyo headquarters, at least they did until COVID, and many more thousands around the world employed by Dentsu. I believe it's the world's largest advertising holding company now. With the rebuilding of post-war Japan in the 1940s and 50s, the economy prospered as manufacturing increased and war shortages eased. By 1953, the National Broadcasting Company was formed. There were lots of newspapers and magazines relaunching, and a new middle class was booming. This is the unveiling of the first broadcasts from the National Television Company. You can see people tuning into that one little TV. The dramatic growth in technology, car, fashion, and consumer brands, combined with a tradition of business acumen, has created strong global brands in Japan like Honda, Nissan, Sony, Seiko, and Shiseido, and more. This is a dramatic fashion-looking ad for Seiko watches from the 60s. It's no surprise that a country with the incredible visual arts tradition of Japan has produced ads with strong graphics and stunning visuals. As in other countries, a number of artists studied in Europe and then returned home and brought Swiss design and Bauhausian principles to Japan. By the 1960s, they easily adopted the new advertising style, uniting words and images in striking compositions like this surreal ad for Honda motorcycles. Some exciting agencies in Turkey. Early ad industry people had close contact with European and advertising industry in the 1950s. As in other markets, economic growth always results in the proliferation of ads and advertising agencies. Local agencies spring up and big multinationals either establish a foothold or acquire local upstarts. This superstar, Ilke Gürpenar, is another female creative director that's doing amazing work. She heads up TBWA Istanbul, again, a small agency that was acquired by the creative holding company TBWA. Very fun ad for hosiery. And an awesome ad for IKEA, promising to organize your socks. Another IKEA ad to keep the varieties of shoes separate in your shoe collection. And another ad in their inimitable graphic style that promises to catch what's hidden in between your teeth with this floss. So the standardization of consumer products in the mid-20th century forced companies to differentiate themselves. Packaged goods companies like Procter & Gamble and invented the science of brand management, giving a product an identity that distinguished it from its nearly indistinguishable competitors. If you think about one soap versus another, there's not a lot that separates them other than their image. Branded products had to offer not just functional but also emotional value to be able to command a premium price. And in the 1950s and 60s, brands like Tide, Kraft, and Lipton were enormously profitable, which set the benchmarks for such professional brand management across all brands. The brand mix includes the logo, the price, the packaging, the promotions, and the advertising, which are typically all guided and organized by the central corporate manufacturer. This results in a transplanting of new cultures for old ones locally, a kind of cultural imperialism which in theory places consumers and their choices in the center. But in reality, locally made and traditional products with their localized cultural meanings are replaced by global products which have global meanings. For example, a local food shop is replaced by a Pizza Hut. In categories such as fashion and food, a global beachhead has been established all over the world, and the trend is inevitably in that direction. The trend towards global cultures for some products is already upon us. And the impact that has on local cultures is only now being studied and understood. The researcher Pierre Thizier-Seya studied the impact of transnational advertising on cultures in the Ivory Coast. He notes that transnational firms such as Colgate and Nestle have helped replace traditional products that were often cheaper and more effective with industrialized toothpastes and infant formulas, which of course are not as healthy as breast milk. By consuming Coca-Cola and Nestle products, Marlboro, Maggi, Colgate, or Revlon, Ivory Coast inhabitants are not only fulfilling unnecessary needs, but also progressively relinquishing their authentic world outlook in favor of the transnational way of life. So there you have it. Advertising, a force for good or for ill. Creativity, something to amuse us, or something that kills local culture. Something to think about.